Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's session with the Office of Continuing Education. This session that you guys are currently in is called Mending Anxious Minds, Recommendations for Increasing the Use of Exposure-Based Procedures by Counselors, presented by Elise Adamopoulos. So I'm going to pass it along to her. Oh, sorry, one other thing. To make sure that you guys get the continuing education certificates, make sure that at the end of the session, a email with a link to a survey is going to be sent to your account, and you can fill out that survey and you'll get your continuing education certificates that way. If you have any questions, let us know throughout the chat. We'll be monitoring it, but other than that, off to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So hi, I'm Elise. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Palo Alto University. And today I'll be presenting part of my research on exposure therapy. So if everybody could just put in the chat so I can get an idea about, are you currently going for your master's? Are you in school? Have you already graduated? What is your current career trajectory? What type of clients are you currently working with? Are you working with kids, adults? So yeah, if you could just put in the chat so I can kind of tailor my presentation to suit the best needs of everybody. And then I will pull up my presentation. Great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Okay, great. Okay, so research has shown that exposure therapy is an effective intervention for children specifically diagnosed with anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, OCD, and DMDD. Um, I know that a lot of past exposure therapy focused on the habituation model. However, research has kind of shown that the inhibitory learning model optimizes exposure even more by focusing on confronting the fear. So the habituation model is more about doing like the gradual hierarchy of anxiety where people rank how anxious they are feeling, um, and usually then the psychologist works with them or the counselor works with them to schedule like different time points that you're going to work on going up the ladder. So like you do a low level and then you slowly increase. However, the inhibitory learning model is the understanding that sometimes we in real life we don't get to experience fear in one situation at a time. So it's understanding how can we retrain the brain so that it's facing the fear with more confidence. So learning about how to deal with the distress, how to manage that intolerance of uncertainty, more like cognitive reframing, um, and learning to deal with like just the basic what ifs in life. Um, so research has found that clinicians do not use exposure therapy as often as other orientations, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as seeking safety behaviors. So teaching like mindfulness, relaxation strategies, anything that's kind of more like regulating the body in the moment. Um, and we need to understand the factors that prevent this implementation of exposure therapy. So I did a data analysis of different research articles. Again, this is just a short snippet of what I'm working on as my dissertation. So what the literature recommends, there is these 5 mistaken assumptions about exposure therapy. Why is it not being implemented as much? So it's found that counselors have different beliefs about using exposure therapy. So most counselors would prefer CBT over exposure therapy because exposure therapy takes a long period of time. So you can imagine if you're doing habitual model where you're doing gradual exposures over time, that's going to take a long time if the client has a lot of anxieties. Um, it also is the length of session required to do that. So it's very hard to do an exposure in only a 15-20 minute session, right? So you want to provide comfort for the client, make sure that they feel safe with you, and then start the exposure, and then have some time at the end to provide feedback for the client to understand how they experience the exposure, and understand providing kind of support for them so that they can go out of the session feeling a little bit more confident and want to come back. Because that's another fear, is that clients will possibly drop out before continuing therapy. So they'll discontinue therapy earlier. Um, and there's also a belief that there's just this lack of training. So a lot of training programs don't emphasize exposure therapy early on, because it does take a long time to actually teach counselors how to do this. So doing training over periods of time, in like a master's program or as like a extra CE credit, would be really beneficial for people. Um, and there's also this fear of lack of resources. So when doing an exposure therapy, there needs to be some sort of presence or some sort of thing that maybe reminds the person of what they're afraid of, or somehow bring them back into the moment. So that's really hard to provide if the client is kind of afraid of possibly like animals or fear of flying. So it's more like trying to get them in that moment of providing them in like kind of like in vivo exposure or imaginal exposure, kind of depending on what you're going with. There might be a lack of resources. Um, and then there's this fear that it might just be dangerous because of how the client reacts. So you can imagine the client is feeling very anxious in that moment, and very distressed because this is something that they have feared. It might be something that they've feared for a while. And now you're asking them to confront that fear without being able to avoid it or run away. And so that could be very distressing. It can cause the client to possibly like have a panic attack in the moment. So learning how to regulate that emotion in your client beforehand is very important. Um, so there are ways to mitigate kind of this fear of using exposure therapy, because that's really what this is all about, is understanding why counselors have this fear of using exposure therapy, which is used for fear. So the idea behind that is just understanding the principles of inhibitory learning model, which I think emphasizes that there are fears every day that people must face. We all have fears that we have to face every day. We won't be able to like avoid all fears for the rest of our life. So learning how to kind of manage that distress in the moment, and understanding how body reacts, understanding how the mind reacts, and then doing some sort of brain training, brain learning, to learn how to manage that anxiety. And then just becoming more confident using exposure therapy, through practicing, through training, however you can get that experience would be really beneficial for you all, just and everybody, just understanding more about the principles of exposure therapy, because it's based on like conditioned stimulus, and kind of to change a conditioned response. So understanding the principles a little better. So there are strategies for counselors to be able to increase their comfortableness with using exposure therapy. and kind of decrease that intolerance of uncertainty and distressing yourself when using this. Um, so the counselor or therapist can create an exposure ladder for themselves, um, something that has um, something that you're afraid of that you need to confront yourself. And you can also take the intolerance of uncertainty scale 12. This is just a short measure that kind of just assesses um, how you feel in the moment, things that make you feel anxious, what happens. Um, Another thing is to make like a grab bag of different activities. So just putting like different unplanned activities into a jar or a basket and then just picking one out and just doing that for the day, kind of being spontaneous in the moment. Not planning ahead or anything, just doing this new activity, getting used to unplanned events. And the other one is to try a restaurant, try a place, go somewhere that you don't know what to expect. Don't look at the menu ahead of time. Don't look at a map ahead of time. Don't look at the activities ahead of time. Just going to someplace new, trying things out, and just being more open to the experience of being in a new situation. And the last one is watching a suspenseful movie or a TV show, something that has like an unexpected or twist ending. I know a lot of people like horror movies or horror TV shows, but there's some other ones. Just something that uh, is new, different, um, and can kind of get that uncomfortable feeling in your body, and you just build build up a tolerance to that. Like, how are you going to respond in the moment with that kind of uncomfortable feeling in yourself? And that helps us to understand our clients a lot more, because now our clients can learn how to tolerate that uncomfortable feelings. We can relate to our clients a lot better. um, so yeah, are there any like questions about exposure therapy, thoughts about using exposure therapy? If you have like any experience using exposure therapy, um, how is what is your kind of perspective on exposure therapy? And you can chat or great. Yeah. Are you excited about using exposure therapy or yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely an idea that a lot of people have, is that being in a room with all your phobias is like really intimidating. So like just holding like you're gonna upgrade by holding a spider or being in a room with a snake, and finding out that exposure therapy is just a way to manage that daily anxiety, honestly, um, is really interesting. Yeah, yeah. So I also love ACT. I use it a lot with my younger clients. And I find that they latch on to this idea of um, understanding that anxiety is something that can be managed by basing it off of understanding that they're I like the not driving the bus. Like, you're driving the bus and then now we need to be a passenger. Like, you're letting your thoughts be the driver of the bus and now you need to be the driver of the bus. And so using exposure therapy with them um, allows them to understand that um, their thoughts don't control them as well, and that their anxiety can actually decrease the more that they recognize that anxiety. Um, and yeah, I think, um, of course, yeah. Um, yeah. So, um, I find that um, my clients who have um, more of a trauma response, so clients who maybe have like shut down, go more internalized, um, they have a bit of a harder time. It's expected for exposure therapy. Um, because putting them back in that situation does seem that it's dangerous, and it can be um like even more heightened anxiety than what is to be expected in that situation. So um what I do first is usually do the cognitive behavioral therapy so that they understand like the cognitive reframing, learning how like thoughts, behaviors, actions are all connected, um and really focusing on like changing their cognitive distortions first and then moving on to the exposure therapy. So kind of merging exposure therapy with the CBT. I think for um, specifically like my clients who have um, maybe some trauma in the home, something happened, um, they benefit a little bit more from starting with the CBT perspective. And then that also builds rapport so that when I do the exposure therapy, it's more like I can trust you. I know that you're not going to hurt me. I know this is a safe space. So I can always like come back to my therapy. We can always come back to the therapy. Um, this is a place where, yes, I'm going to face my fear, but it's in a way that I can grow. So putting it kind of more into the cognitive realm, and kind of going away from like avoiding that feeling, avoiding that cognition. Because that's what I find with a lot of kids. It's like I'm going to avoid that in adults. I think I'm going to avoid that situation that I don't know what to expect, or I'm going to avoid that thought because that's something that uh, caused me a lot of anxiety in the past. And so, kind of building up um, their uh, kind of like queue of toolbox of thoughts and behaviors that increase positive emotions and um, provide more um, comfort in that therapy room. And then moving to the exposure therapy has been really beneficial, just because it's just overall just a better relationship with the client, I think. Yeah. Are there any other thoughts on um, why exposure therapy is not being used, or kind of your thoughts about using exposure therapy? Any, um, maybe you've held some of the mistaken assumptions, or kind of the core beliefs about using exposure therapy is stopping you from using this intervention? Yes. Um, so I actually have done exposure therapy over telehealth. Um, I actually enjoyed it more um, because I feel like the client could be in their typical safe space than in the office. So I think that when they're in the office, first you have to build rapport, get them acclimated to the therapy room, working with the therapist. Um, and then when it's telehealth, they can do it wherever they are in their safe space. So sometimes I say, okay, let's move to your room. Where's your safe space? Where's your safe corner? And so they took their laptop and they took me into their room where they had like a chair, or they sat on the floor, or they sat in their bed. Um, and just trying to help them first by like, okay, let's imagine what's the fear. What are we afraid of? What are the thoughts that kind of happen when you're in that space, when you're in that moment? And it could be anything from like, I'm worried I'm going to die. I'm worried that I'm going crazy. I'm worried how other people will perceive me in that moment. Um, and moving that to changing the cognition to, um, well, I can do this. Nobody's watching me. I'm in I'm by myself here, but nobody's going to watch me. And just being more open to that experience, I think was really helpful with using telehealth. Um, there's also research being done on like using exposure therapy with virtual realities that has been really helpful. So putting out, like putting on the glasses and putting yourself in that situation has been shown to be really helpful for a lot of people, because it's not only imagining yourself being put in that situation, now you can actually see it and it actually feels more real in that moment. Um, the only thing I would say when using exposure therapy over telehealth, that was difficult was when the client was in a lot of distress. And of course, you're not in the room physically. And so what I found was really important was always to have like a parent's phone number, or somebody and another adult in the house with them, that can just kind of step in, and then I talk them through how to like regulate the emotion a lot more. So like going back to those um, kind of like mindfulness techniques, and also understanding that we can confront our thoughts in the moment. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Exposure therapy is a lot for clients, especially young clients. I think because in their mind, if it's anxiety producing, we're gonna not do it. Like I'm just not gonna confront that. Um, and that's not realistic. And I think explaining that to kids, I usually explain that first off, like you can't avoid all your fears all the time. Like at some point in your life, this is going to be a barrier to something you want to do, or this is going to come up at some point in your life, and you're going to have to do something about it. Um, and so explaining them to them why I think confronting your fears is better, that actually gets them into the mindset of more being more open to learning about it, being more open to experiencing um, whatever the fear is in the moment. Um, I think that with clients who already have like a high um, level of anxiety, I think I tend to do more of like anxiety management with them, where I focus more on um, thinking about your thoughts, but also putting yourself in different situations where you experiencing that worry, and how worry and anxiety changes depending on the situation, who's in the room, um, and understanding that sometimes anxiety is everywhere. Um, but learning how, okay, in this situation, this is what I'm afraid of. And in this situation, this is what I'm afraid of. Well, those two things are kind of related. So let's focus on that. Because a lot of kids don't see it as that way. They see it as separate entities of like school, home, after school care, like, and then like friends and family, and putting things in boxes, and um, having them draw it out has been really helpful, where it's this is how I feel at this place with this situation going on, um, and then comparing different drawings, and so different clients draw different ways, but it's all like usually like a lot of color in one area and then using more like the dark reds and blacks in another area and trying to understand overall how that's going to affect them. And so having them visualize their anxiety. And it kind of goes back to like that idea of like externalizing the anxiety at first with kids. So like doing like worry monsters, things that are helpful for kids, are like understanding that anxiety can be managed, and creating like a visual of the anxiety has been really helpful. Yeah, yeah. Phone therapy is really challenging. That's amazing. Like, because I find that um it's hard to like understand, okay, is the client paying attention? Is the client doing something else right now? Um, I had I feel that the client could be there's a lot more distractions with phone therapy, but it's also again helpful because you're in their space. So they can, of course, take the phone anywhere that they need to be. But yeah, I can imagine that doing phone therapy, probably not the best with exposure therapy because there is that level of distress and trying to get clients to face their uncertainty in the moment. Yeah. So um I do sometimes ask them to rate their level of distress, um, just so that they can see, like, okay, like that was, I'm really distressed about this situation in my head, but when I actually do it, um, it might go lower, it might actually go higher. Um, but I find that focusing on the inhibitory learning model, um, actually doesn't ask them to rate their anxiety, which is um an interesting concept because I've been so used to asking about okay, what's like your minimum level versus a severe level of anxiety, what causes you the most level of anxiety. Um, and so the inhibitory learning model is more like understanding their thoughts in the moment, um, and trying to understand, okay, anxiety overall is high. Um, it doesn't matter what situation, I just have this fear of anxiety. Um, and it's not asking the client to um, kind of understand the exposure therapy based on their anxiety response. So like in the past, I feel like exposure therapy was more like this is effective only if my anxiety goes down, but as soon as my anxiety goes up, oh, I'm not doing this right. I mean, I can't continue doing this. And the client that actually causes more anxiety in the client because now they're rating their anxiety about doing an exposure therapy to help them with their anxiety. And so it's like anxiety on top of anxiety. Um, and I find that with the inhibitory learning model, it's you're not thinking about ranking your anxiety or trying to say at the end of it, this is only effective if my anxiety decreases. It's the understanding that anxiety is always going to be there when there's a feared response, and something that is unknown. And so helping them to reframe their thoughts, um, and really just learn that anxiety is not something to be avoided anymore, because there's never going to be a situation where there's nothing that they're afraid of in that moment. At some point, their anxiety is going to increase. Um, And so helping them to learn overall, okay, when I feel anxiety, no matter what level it is, I can change my thoughts. I can do this other activity. I can somehow move the brain to focus on reframing the situation. So if I'm afraid of doing something like flying, that I'm gonna retrain my brain in the moment to think about that I'm not like I will have the thought that I'm going to die, and then retraining the brain to think about I can handle this situation, nobody's paying attention to me, I know what to do in this situation, I feel confident in this situation. Just trying to do kind of like those um affirmations and changing how their beliefs about the situation are. um and I think that's pretty different than how exposure therapy was taught in the past, where it was um, first, when you have a client with anxiety, okay, we need to create the fear hierarchy, and understanding how going up, we have to go up the ladder. And we actually have realized that might be causing more anxiety in clients, because now they're worried that if they are not making the same progress, or they actually might be going down the ladder at some point, that feels like a failure in some way. And so um, overall, just learning how to um, retrain the brain, focusing on how do you manage the stress in overall situations, has been kind of the benefit of the new model of looking at exposure therapy. Okay. Um, that's interesting. Hmm, yeah, yeah. So I think that um, with OCD specifically, I think that um, going through gradual exposures um, can be helpful, where it's like, okay, like you're gonna c- gradually build on that exposure. Um, but I think, again, trying to start with the CBT and then moving to exposure therapy has been really helpful. Um, because then it's teaching them more about how to manage their thoughts first, um, and trying to like re refocusing their thoughts on something else, and then doing the exposure therapy. Um, because sometimes when just doing the exposure therapy, um, it's definitely not something the client is used to. It's unfamiliar for them. And I think that we need to prepare the client to kind of build up to that. So starting with CBT is really helpful, because it feels more comfortable. Just talking about thoughts and feelings and behaviors kind of like outside of self. So it's like these are the things going on with me. And then moving into exposure therapy, um, while you have that therapeutic relationship, is more effective, because now they already know how to do cognitive reframing. So now I'm just asking you to do cognitive reframing in exposure therapy, where it's okay, let's retrain how you think about this situation, um, and get used to um, how you're feeling, thinking in that moment, so it doesn't cause you the same level of distress moving forward. Um, I think with OCD, I think that it's not just touching things or doing the behavior that's being avoided, but um the thought behind it, where it's like, if I do this, then this will happen. So like I will die, my house will blow up, um, my parents will get divorced. Something that kind of interrupts that connection. I think that's the benefit of doing an exposure, because then it's like, okay, I did that behavior. Okay, now, but that didn't happen. Um, and doing that repeatedly, okay, I did that again and that didn't happen again. It's trying to create that separation between the thought and the what ifs, basically, and creating that space to being more open to more experiences, and just being more open to learning more about life, honestly, because now they don't have that fear trying to uh, hold them back. Yeah. Yeah. Um, are there any ideas about like um, trying to like balance intolerance of uncertainty um, in yourself, like the ideas of like doing an unplanned activity or going someplace new? Um, does Are there any thoughts about that? Does that sound interesting to people? Are there other ideas that people have for things to do? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I love doing mindfulness as for myself, and then I also do it with my clients, and doing like progressive muscle relaxation, um, and I like mindfulness because they can do it anywhere once they get practice with it. So practicing with the clients is always important. Even if they feel totally comfortable that day, asking them to do a mindfulness activity. Um, and I think that when doing an exposure therapy, um, like during the debriefing part is probably the time to do the mindfulness and then talk about self-care afterwards. Um, so it causes a lot of distress, obviously. So asking the client to just go back into the world and like nothing happened in therapy is not good. So um part of the end part of exposure therapy is talking about the exposure and how it made them feel in that moment, and um any feelings towards the therapist. And I've definitely gotten anger, resentment, and annoyance when doing an exposure therapy. Um, I think just because that's not what they expected to come out of it. And so being able to be confronted with those strong emotions, especially in children, um, is something to learn. And then talking about, okay, like what are what are we going to do now that um we have to go back outside, but before we go, is there something that we can do that would kind of make you feel better or make you feel calm? And a lot of people pick up like the fidget toys in the room. Some kids just go back to quiet play on like the sand table and just don't want to talk to me for the rest of the session. um and that's fine. Like maybe they're just self-reflecting, and just needing that quiet time for themselves before ending session. And so trying to manage the anxiety, but then also manage the tension and kind of the conflict that might come afterwards. I think that's why a lot of people don't use it, is because then it's like, okay, this person hates me, they're never going to come back. And understanding that that doesn't need to be feared, that um, the client will probably come back. They probably don't want to do it again, but understanding, teaching them about that the more you experience something, that like the less afraid you are of it. And also doing um, something positive. So I definitely encourage them to do something fun over the weekend, something that they can look forward to. And part of that self-care routine is usually like being with your family, or just watching TV, playing video games, doing something fun after a heavy therapy session like that. Um, and it's always interesting because then when they come back, uh, after the first session, they're usually saying they don't want to do it again. But then after you continue with the exposure, they're kind of learning more and more that this is not something I need to be afraid of. Um, and so it's more like a new challenge for them. It's a new like a new level to be conquered. So I don't let them have a fidget toy during the actual exposure, just because I found that that was distracting, and they won't always have that fidget toy, especially like sometimes in the classroom, like the teacher doesn't allow them to have a fidget toy if they're like taking a test or something. And so during the actual exposure, I don't let them have it, but it's after the exposure is over when I say, okay, we're all done. Like, what do you want to do now? What do you want to play with? Where are you going? They always go over to the fidget toy box and they can pick out what fidget toy they want to play with. Um, and I think just kind of like separating that safety behavior from being afraid, where it's more like, okay, I can use my thoughts to get me out of this, instead of doing like a behavior or an action, has been really effective with working with the kids. Yeah, yeah, definitely providing like psychoed, um, and yes, understanding the what is happening to me. Uh, and it's interesting because then after they do the exposure therapy for a while, um, they're they want to like they have other anxieties that they start bringing up, and just anxiety in general. Um, and so then they're like, okay, I'm also anxious about this and this, and so it's like, okay, can you use the same techniques that you did in the past to manage the anxiety in this situation? Um, yeah. All right. Any other thoughts about exposure therapy, using exposure therapy? Any other questions about using exposure therapy? Of course. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's kind of different for each uh kid, but for overall, I always start where I provide like the psycho ed about exposure therapy each time. Even if they're like, oh, I've already heard this before, but like explaining that exposure therapy helps you to learn how to manage your anxiety, helps you to um go on with your life, understanding that fear is normal, that a feared response is normal, but when we have anxiety, it's this heightened fear, and that actually causes us to either like the flight, fight, or freeze method. So I always explain that too. And then um like going into the exposure therapy, I usually do imaginal. So like imagine yourself in the situation, asking them to either draw it out or just describe it depending on what age they are. Um, and so asking them to picture where's the place, asking them to picture like imagine what are you sitting, are you standing, what is the like room around you look like, is there anybody else in the room, who else is in the room, and just are there any sounds, like trying to explain like using the senses, are there any things that you can touch in that moment, what else is in the room, um and then moving on from that, okay, we're in this space, asking them first to go through their thoughts. Okay, what are you thinking right now? Okay, I'm thinking I'm gonna die. I'm thinking I'm not gonna survive this, are usually like the most common things. And so I said, okay, you're gonna have the thought that you're gonna die. All right, we're gonna sit here for a little while longer. How can we reframe that thought, you're gonna die? What are some other thoughts that you can have in that moment? Um, and this is why I like to start with CBT, because they already kind of expect that prompt from me when using CBT. I always use that. So like, what else can you think about in this moment? So are there like, okay, like I can do this. I've tried hard things. I can do this again. Um, I can um I can confront my fears. Like I haven't experienced this yet. Like the power of using the word yet has been really helpful with kids. Like I can, um, and I feel like there's another one that they usually like, but those are kind of like the main ones. Um, and then, okay, like how does your body feel in this moment? Feels tense. I have a headache. I feel sick to my stomach. Um, and then trying to understand how like the thoughts and the body are connected. So if we change the thought, okay, now how does your body feel when thinking about you're in this moment? How does your when your thought changes, how does your body change? So okay, like now I can breathe again. Um I can slow my heart rate down. Um and then finishing up with trying to focus on something else. Is there something else in the space that you can focus on? Is there something else that um, you can think about when you're in that moment that won't cause you the same level of distress? And so a lot of them then say, oh, I will hug my mom, or I will go hug my stuffed animal. I said, okay, nope, that we can't touch mom, we can't hug stuffed animal. What else are we gonna do? And so trying them to, because that's always their go-to. And so like trying to expand their cognitive beliefs. So it's I can control the situation. I don't have to rely on other people or other things in the moment. Um, and then after doing all of the cognitive behavioral piece and then focusing on the exposure that um they have been in for actually a few quite some time now, probably like 10 minutes, I usually just say, okay, like deep in, deep breathe out, and we're done. Okay, let's do, where do you want to go, where's your safe space? In here in the therapy room. And so that's when they go to the sand table or the fidget toy box. So trying not to expand the exposure for too long. um and that's when I always do the debriefing part too, is when they're in their back, regulating their emotions, not feeling that same level of distress. Yeah, so that's kind of like the steps that I kind of go through with the kids that I work with when doing exposure therapy. Yeah, any other thoughts or questions before we end today? Yes, actually, yeah, with my adult client, that I saw that I did exposure with last year. Yes, I do ask them to go to a safe space afterwards. So because it was last year, it was over telehealth, so they were already in their room, which was their safe space. Um, and so what was great about that was when I asked when like during the debriefing time, um, they like would sit up and then um usually they had something in that they were going to look at in their room. So like it was like their favorite picture or something that kind of reminded them of like a loved one or something that brought them peace in that moment. So if my client was religious, then um they would have some sort of religious object, or like with my client it was a picture of her dog. Yes, I don't with the adult client, I did a little bit longer. I did have them actually in doing the exposure for about 30 minutes, which is a long time to sit with somebody experiencing a lot of distress. But I think with adult clients, realizing that they have thoughts that just keep coming up with the more times I did it. So like the first thought is I'm gonna die, but then there's obviously other thoughts that come after that that don't come until we've been doing exposure therapy for a few sessions. With the kid client, I do it for a shorter amount of time, just so that it's a little bit more manageable, just because asking them to sit still for longer than 10 minutes isn't developmentally appropriate for me. I don't want them to um not be able to focus. And I think that after 10 minutes they start to wiggle around. But with adult clients it's a lot easier because they are a little bit more persistent about sitting and being in that space for long periods of time. Yes, it is very similar to EMDR, yeah. Um, and I think that explaining the time frame at the beginning is also helpful, especially with kids. Sometimes just like setting the timer up on the board is helpful, because then it's like, okay, we're only going to do this for 10 minutes. And so when they start like peeking and like opening their eyes, they can like see, okay, we're almost done. And that provides a little bit more relief in the moment when they're feeling a lot of distress. I don't tell them how much time is left. Um, I try to make them stay more present in the exposure and um, what's going on in that moment. But I can't cover all the clocks, so I think that's something that's helpful for them when they can kind of regulate their own time and their own emotions in that moment. Yeah. All right. But I make sure that um yeah, there's some time in between my session and the next session, because I know there's another session afterwards. But um thank you everyone for coming and participating today. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. And I hope that you can use exposure therapy with your adult clients, your kid clients, and um yeah, anything else. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so you're all so welcome. I'm glad that you can all be here today. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us all today, everybody. Make sure to fill out the survey at the end of this program to ensure that you receive your continuing education certificates. But if there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end today's call. Have a good day, everybody.